I participated in 5 of those chamber music. We did a Mozart serenade, the E-flat serenade, wind octet. We did a soldier's tale, a complete soldier's tale, narrated by James Earl Jones II, who was like a cousin of James Earl Jones. That turned out quite well. We did the Stravinsky Octet for Winds. We did a Mio Cheminée du Rouen, the wind quintet, and we also did a wonderful arrangement, wind octet arrangement of the Prokofiev Romeo and Juliet, 8 excerpts from Romeo and Juliet, by a composer named Andreas Parkman. And I had never heard of this arrangement, but it's quite effective for standard wind octet, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 horns, and 2 bassoons, and the second oboe doubles English horn. Very effective, and that turned out really well. Um, Next month, we're going to be doing the Grand Partita also, and this is all going to be shown through the CSO website on CSO TV. So that's our new activity these days. But in the meantime, during the months of November, December, and most of January, I'm holed up here in Sister Lakes, Michigan, where Teresa and uh, myself and our daughter Mia, who's in high school now, are carrying on everything online. So we've been teaching, we've been collaborating, we've been talking to Andy Simon in Hong Kong, as you know, who has this wonderful licorice chat, and everybody should be familiar with that. That's a wonderful activity, and just learning some new music and getting ready for the next round. Uh,
Great.
Oh, I was happy to hear Jonathan play the Mozart Concerto that was a couple of years ago, wasn't it? In Ostend in Belgium. That
Yeah,
was
Ostend was right. 2 summers ago, right?
Yeah, that was delightful. And I had a chance to play your new basset clarinet, which hopefully you'll tell us about that Royal made. But mine's a Yamaha and I think Nick has the same one, right? It's a Yamaha that's in production, and I think they've been making it since the early 1990s. And I was one of the first ones to be in on the creation of this instrument. It was actually designed by a trombone player. Isn't that
Really?
interesting?
Which
The
trombone player?
designer, the musical instrument designers at Yamaha are very expert and meticulous, and they all work on the instruments in Hamamatsu in their factory.
Right.
And so I was privileged to go to the factory a few times, and there I met the designer, and I said, "Oh, are you a clarinet player?" "No, I'm a trombonist." So I said, "Wow, well, you did a good job on creating this basset clarinet, but everything is quite
That's very
precise."
interesting, actually, because I did the Boston premiere of the Mozart Clarinet Concerto, played correctly in the early '90s, with '92 or '93, and it
Mhm.
was on a Bassett clarinet that had just been made by LeBlanc. So I guess both of those
Yep.
manufacturers were doing it around the same time. It's interesting.
Well, I had the LeBlanc first. I got my LeBlanc in 1986, and
Uh
that
huh.
was
Yeah.
I have a LeBlanc basset clarinet, and it's quite good. They aren't all good because Larry had one too. Larry Combs had a LeBlanc basset clarinet, and I tried it, and it just wasn't that good. And mine, I got lucky because my LeBlanc is a pretty good one, but this one is better in terms of intonation, and it's still a challenge intonationally. Um, but it's a better instrument. The LeBlanc is had a beautiful sound. I enjoyed the LeBlanc. Do you still have your LeBlanc,
Yeah,
Jonathan?
I still have it.
Yeah.
But shortly after I played on that LeBlanc, I started playing on the Rossi clarinet, and I got spoiled by the perfection of the Rossi clarinet, and I could never go back to that. I just never quite, you know. So that's why
Hmm.
I said to Yuan Gao, I said, you got to design a new basset for me because I don't want to play that LeBlanc anymore because it's not as good as my Rossi's. So you have to design a basset that's as good as my Rossi's, and he did
Yeah,
that with
well,
me.
when I tried your Royal basset clarinet in Belgium, I really was very impressed with it. I'd like to play it more, actually. It's a very good instrument.
Absolutely. So Nick, how about you?
Well, I gather the basset I play on
Turn
is.
up the gain, Nick. You're hard to hear.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. I gather my basset was, I think, number 9 and yours was number 10, or the other way round, John.
Not this says. Well, I don't know. The number says 101029.
Oh, no, that's not the serial number. The number of
Oh.
bassets they had made.
Oh, really?
I mean,
Could be.
yes,
I don't know.
yeah. So that was, I think,
They're
the
litter
nature of it.
mates.
They were, you
They're
know,
litter mates in
next
the
to each
basset.
other. They are a pair. They're our pair. Yeah.
Nice.
But
Nice.
mine, I guess I've had it super padded, and that means you can lighten the action significantly. I use an elasticated sling with it. And what else have I had done? I guess I've had sort of leather touch pieces put onto the thumb keys to, you know, aid getting around those. But I guess, and I've tuned quite a lot of it, of course, a lot of the basset notes at the bottom. Yeah, anyway, so Jessica, I've sent this, I hope, to your Gmail account now, this resource. So I don't know whether it'll be possible to share it with people, but it gives everyone a chance to see a few useful references, and the Vintator manuscript as well, which of course is on IMSLP for everyone to download.
So the Vintator manuscript is what is in Mozart's own handwriting of the sketch that he did for basset horn in G.
Yeah, I'll share it with
And
you.
that's
I have it right
yeah.
here. Let me share my screen. I'll show
Yeah.
everyone what we're talking about.
There's
Oh, Jessica,
actually-
you need to enable my screen sharing.
Oh yes.
Say hi.
There's also a YouTube clip of the 199 bars played on a contemporary basset horn in G by Gilles Thomet. If you're interested in hearing it.
The interesting thing about the Vintator, though, because I use this as one of the sources for my new edition, is there are many things in there where Mozart has marked things very explicitly, and you can see precisely what he wants. There are other passages where they're not quite so explicit and got to use some judgment, but there are many things that are explicit. And then one of the most interesting things in there is when he switches into A major. Now, you don't see it in the clarinet part, of course, because the clarinet is just, you know, written in C major, and originally the orchestra is in G. But at that point in time, and he only has the bass line underneath it, if you look at the harmony that the bass is playing and you say, wait a minute, that's A major, not G major anymore. And that's at about measure 179, as I recall. But so you can see that while he was making this manuscript, which according to their best dating was in 1791, according to the paper dating, he changed his mind. And that no doubt was because of discussions that he had with Anton Stadler, who had clarinets in G and F, E flat, and in A and B flat, which interestingly Stadler didn't make, despite what everybody says. Everyone said Stadler made his own instruments. That was one of the lies that Stadler promulgated to make himself seem more cool.
He was a pretty cool guy, that Stadler.
I think the conversation must have gone something like this. Hi, this is Anton Stadler here, Wolfgang. I just want to tell you, not basset horn in G, but basset clarinet in A. To which Mozart must have said, "What? I've already started this damn piece. I've written 199 bars of this piece. You expect me to change it now?"
Yeah. Yeah, one of the very specific things is the articulation in measure 86 and 87, where you know, in other editions, it's not very specific that the first time is really staccato, and then the second time is legato.
I'll show this to everybody. Here's the Vintator manuscript, and the passage that John is talking about is right here.
Yeah, that's right.
And you
That's
can
no,
see
no. You went by it. You went. Oh yeah, there it is. Uh huh.
right here. So you can see the staccatos. He actually
Hmm.
marks the staccatos right here.
Yeah.
And then
And then the next one is
next one
legato.
is legato. And it's because there's a sequence in the violas actually that goes from, and then we answer that with, so
Mm-hmm.
the, and so that all ties it together. But that's very specific articulation that he wants
Very
dots on the first
specific.
one and not on the second. And
Yeah,
that kind of
which
thing
is
you see everywhere. Hmm.
and you have to do it because it's in his own handwriting. You know.
Right.
Mm. I think it was only in the first edition that eventually the staccatos were then reproduced. So I guess, it depends what importance you give the Vintator manuscript as a primary source of deciding what to play in that particular place. I mean, uh, the um, the Vintator manuscript is only a sketch and it's not for the correct instrument. And by the time we get to the first edition, some things have changed, and we know that some things have been edited out. So it's complicated to say that all the time we should trust the Vintator manuscript. But I think the most important thing, which John has already reiterated, is that if you look at this, you probably saw when John Cohler was sharing the screen that there's very little detail there at all. In fact, most of it is blank.
Right.
What do we see? We see basically the top line of the clarinet part. We see the bass part, and that's intermittent. It's not even there all the time. And occasionally Mozart has a good idea, say for instance for a tutti, and he puts in in the section that the strings have, the tutti section. So he has a good idea,
Mm-hmm.
and he shoves something in the second violin and the first violin there. But apart
Yeah.
from that, it's
Measure 40.
mostly blank.
But he notates.
The issue that people face is, what do we get from the Vintator manuscript? Well, you actually get very, very specific guidance on the articulation, and that gives us very clear pointers on what kind of articulation Mozart might have been up to. And the really astounding thing is that Mozart in the sketch here is conceiving this already with a soloist playing it to such a degree that he has notated the articulation in place, and that's the only thing he's notated. He hasn't even written the blooming bass part yet.
Well, in many passages he does. Let me show a few spots of this because I have the whole thing right here, and I marked out a couple that I wanted to share because I used this for some of the stuff in my edition, and you always have to make judgments. But so here, one of the interesting things is he's very specific about note length as well as articulation. So for example, you notice this is an eighth note here. For some reason, my
Mm.
pen is not working. Wait, why is the pen? Hold on a second. Let's get the pen to go to blue. And then is it working? There we go. You see that eighth note? It's not a quarter note. And why is
Right.
that? That's because the bass comes in here 1/8 note later. Now, if you move ahead to the next interesting place, you see corresponding stuff. This figure is a very important one, actually, because what that tells us is that this motif that we play, that in the current edition is, he had actually written it in this sketch as, and we know from Mozart's father that when you had these repeated notes with two notes and a slur and repeated, you would lift the note a little. This becomes one of the things that's most often incorrectly played by orchestras, where they'll play it, and they do that because they take a down bow on that measure when it should be an up bow, and it should be lifted because of the way Mozart said that type of articulation was to be played, and his father said so too. Over here is another articulation that that Nick was talking about. He gives us a very explicit articulation here, here, here. That's one of the main themes, right? That's your, so it's not the way you hear it in most performances. And the violins state it first, so they're kind of defining that theme for us. If you go ahead to a place like this, you can see
Then,
that
of
he
course,
says,
not to mention the alteration on the F natural.
right, correct, and that's all in here,
Which,
exactly.
yeah,
Right.
it's all in there, and nobody should play anything except for an F natural there.
That's right. That's right. This one I found kind of interesting. This passage, he doesn't have an articulation here, but the notes, you'll notice it's not, he doesn't write 4/16 notes. He writes a grace note. Why? Because the actual theme, if you look back to where the violin stated it, was, that's what the violins play. When the clarinet is playing it, it's the second time this theme has been played, and this is already a written out ornamentation. Right? And so it's interesting that D is a grace note. It's not a principal note. And yet when most people play this, they play as if the D is the important note. But the D is just the grace note, because the main note is that G, right? But those are the
But
kind
you
of
know what,
things you would
Jonathan?
never
I
know
think
unless you saw this. Sorry, what'd you say?
but I think many times when the grace note is written, it is a dissonance, and the dissonance should be brought out. So if it's a matter of interpretation,
Mm-hmm.
if you want to emphasize it, I think it's within the style to emphasize the appoggiatura.
You could make
Even if
that
it's a grace
argument.
note.
Yeah, you could make that argument, sure. Usually in the classical period, appoggiaturas, yeah, like if you go, it's usually strong weak on the
Hmm.
dominant seventh and the resolution, unless it's a final cadence where it's often weak strong, right? Ba-dam on the final one, right? But and most grace notes in the unless it's a lead into a trill, but in this period they were usually weak. But you could make the argument that it's a strong grace note too.
It depends on the individual circumstance, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But there's too many things to talk about. There's so many interesting things in here. Right before the passage you mentioned about the staccato here,
Hmm.
there's this figure, and I found that interesting because you'll notice that Mozart marks this with a bar across 4 notes.
Mm.
Whereas you remember in most editions people play it and they separate the D from the C and actually sort of emphasize the high C. But Mozart didn't write it that way. He just wrote a group of 4. So when I play this, I try to make it like one line, going all the way to the strong appoggiatura on the F sharp.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But again,
Okay,
this is the kind of thing you would never know unless you looked at this,
no, exactly. I think there's a danger though in reading too much into a sketch.
Yeah, I agree.
Look, we have a lot of really useful info about the articulation, and I think my point remains that Mozart is just jamming down these notes in the melody part, but
Yeah.
he's also notating the articulation. So he has a very clear understanding of how he wants the soloist to play, even in sketch form, before he's written, the viola part or even the bass part in full. I think one of the interesting things, for instance, that we discover in the articulation is that Mozart's beloved use of portato. That's the dots over the notes and the slur. And Mozart obviously understood a very specific and very different type of articulation when we get to those passages.
Right here, you're talking, which he
Yeah,
notates
exactly.
with the dot and the slur. And that's
exactly.
in the manuscript, right?
Exactly. And I think one of the interesting things there is it's preceded by one of the only slurs over a bar line in this piece. If you look for slurs over bar lines in Mozart's music, you don't find them very often.
Right.
And why is that? Well, that's because, the articulation is a part of the language of classical music. And, you and I and John know that beats 1 and 3 in a Mozart allegro are the main beats that we want to emphasize all the way through. So if it's in 4/4, it needs to feel more or less in 2/2. So in C stroke, we might call it.
Right.
And so we need to hear those two beats.
C stroke, cut time.
Yeah, and yeah, C stroke.
The other interesting thing about
C stroke, I never heard it called
You
that.
never heard of that? Yeah.
The other interesting thing about that spot, though, that you mentioned with the portato marking and the slur over the bar line, is that right at that point is where the orchestra stops. And that is in Mozart basically in his letters to his father and the books and everything was you always keep the tempo steady. And when you make a rubato, your left hand, if you use a piano analogy, your left hand is steady. The right hand can wander around a little bit, but the left hand has to be steady. However, the exception to that rule is when the rhythm stops. Either the orchestra completely stops or they just come to a whole note that has no rhythm. And that's one of those points, which is why when you come to you must do some rubato there. In other words, it's not
the one place.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And if you don't do rubato, you're not playing in Mozart style,
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
But it also it reflects the context, because the context everywhere else is eighth note pulse, and then suddenly it stops.
Yeah.
Right.
So you have the opportunity to do that.
One place later on I was going to just talk about. Can I share screen as well?
Sure.
Is that possible? Okay, so let me just see if I can share screen. So I've got it up on my screen as well. I'll just do that. Hang on a second. Okay, so this passage here that you'll probably see, this I think reveals how Mozart thinks.
Yep.
Okay, so we've got this passage here, so let's just play it for the benefit of people. Okay, so we all know this passage here, but here what I'm just going to point out is that you'll see immediately after that Mozart started to write it out again, and then he's put a little box there and he's scrubbed it all out.
Right.
And he's understood that he needs to repeat this passage twice for the listener to be primed for the next tutti section, which is da 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 dee da. And basically, what does he do? Well, he just puts a bracket over the entire passage, and he thinks, okay,
Bis.
I know what I'm going to do here.
And
I'll
he
write.
says bis.
It said bis. It says twice in Latin. Okay, so we kind of understand that Mozart realizes how much expectation is required in music before he changes something, before he varies an episode here. And I think that it just shows how Mozart's mind works. So we have this kind of repetition, da 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 dee da 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 dee da, and then the little bass section, and he realizes, I have to do that twice because the listener needs to hear this twice before I change it.
And of course, you should ornament it the second time.
Yes, right.
Exactly.
Because the whole purpose of repetition, if it's an extremely short repetition, like half a measure or two measure or one measure, maybe not, but any sort of melodic thing that's some reasonable length, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 measures, that's repeated in the classical period, was done for the purpose of ornamentation. Now, how much ornamentation you do, the ornamentation could be simply that you change the dynamic, for example, in some cases. But it must be changed in some way when it's repeated, which is kind of ironic because he's written the same thing twice. And the rule is basically whenever there's the same thing, it must be different.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Except if you read Daniel Took, the famous writer of a piano method around this period. Who,
Uh-huh.
when is he writing? 1780 or something like that. So he's talking about, high classicism. He says that some themes are so noble and so wonderful that it seems a shame to mess with them. Effectively, I'm paraphrasing him, but
Right.
anyone can look this up. I'll put this in the chat so
Hmm.
people can
And
understand.
that's certainly, the shorter you get, that's going to be more true. If it's a very short element, yeah, sure, maybe it bears repeating a few times with no change at all. But, when you have something that's that long, like that thing, you got to do something to that. It could be just that you do the first one loud and the second one soft and don't change the notes. But then there's any number of things you could do with the notes.
Right. I think to illustrate how much ornamentation was actually done by performers in those days, you can read correspondence that Mozart wrote to his dad, and he would complain about the amount of ornamentation that singers, for example, were doing with his music. So it was something that was part and parcel of the style of performance of the time. Just as Baroque ornamentation was, classical ornamentation was de rigueur. It was done all the time. So we, in order to produce something with that style, we have to embrace that concept of ornamentation.
And one of the rule there were, I mean, obviously by its nature, ornamentation and improvisation are very free, but they still had very classical rules to them. So
Hmm.
you got to fit within the harmony, you got to fit within the rhythm. It's not like modern jazz.
Right.
um,
Yeah.
and and then you got to fit within a certain level of taste.
Hmm.
But one of the other sort of general rules that was written about was that if the passage itself is already an ornamental passage, you don't want to add much at all. Maybe one
Right.
grace note, but you don't want to
Right.
go ornamenting something that's already ornamental. It's like putting jewelry on top
Absolutely.
of jewelry.
Yeah. Gilding the
So,
lily.
so, gentlemen, how do we establish taste, for instance, in the slow movement? I mean, that's really difficult. Say, for instance, is this tasteful or not?
Each person will have.
I'll tell you, I
I
loved
love it.
everything except one thing in that. The
Okay.
playing was gorgeous, but I'll tell
I
you the
love it.
one thing that I would take issue with in that was in the second measure when you went,
Yeah.
because of what happens in the orchestra
In the
on the
orchestra,
second
yes.
beat.
That's right.
I would do, so you get out of the way for the
Yeah,
second
yeah,
beat.
exactly. Before the, yes.
Right. But other than that, I thought that was beautiful.
Oh, okay, right,
I
fine.
loved it.
Yeah.
See, I would say that was
Perfectly
probably
tasteful.
I
Perfectly
would say that was
tasteful.
probably overdone, and I would say that,
No.
these days I wouldn't play it like that. Although I think in the 1990s I did play it like that on the basset the
Hmm.
first time I played it. These days I would probably go with Daniel Turk and just play it, you know, slightly softer the second
You
time
you
round.
know,
And
we do have some evidence from both Bach's time and Mozart's time of various people who were like a student of Beethoven or a student of Bach or a student of Mozart, or who had written out some ornamented passages. And every one that I've seen, including ones from Bach's time, were highly, highly ornamented, much more than you would think of nowadays. And so, whenever I've seen an example, I mean, we don't have that many, but all the examples that I've seen did very ornate ornamentation. So, if anything, I think we tend to err on the conservative side nowadays. But
Mhm.
that's just my opinion.
I think a lot of it would have to do with the particular day and venue also. If you have a very dry venue, oftentimes you have to manipulate things like the tempo. You might want the tempo to be a little bit faster. You could
Hmm.
do a little bit more ornate ornamentation because that would speak better. If you have a very echoey environment, maybe you want to be leaner with the ornamentation and maybe take a slower tempo to be able to let the listener absorb the music. So I think a lot of it has to do with the spontaneity of the particular moment, and all of that. I think to be perfectly tasteful, I think all of that can be taken into consideration.
Absolutely. One of the challenges that I faced in making my recording was when I do a recording session. I think what most people do, you do multiple takes, right? And then you edit the stuff together and you make your best
Mhm.
recording. So if you're going to improvise a different Eingang each time, you're not going to be able to edit it together. So I decided ahead of the recording session, I had to decide on what were all my Eingangs going to be
Mhm.
exactly, so that I could essentially play them exact, even though they sound improvised, they got to be exactly the same on every take, and then I could edit it and make it perfect. So I wrote all those out, and part of the audition, a part of the edition I published, I provided all of these same Eingangs that are on my recording. So for students out there, you can see exactly what I did and listen to it on the recording. But then you can go make up your own, but it gives you a lot of ideas about what you might try.
Right.
Mhm.
That's what I love hearing about hearing performances of classical music like this piece, about hearing your performance, Jonathan, about hearing others that have done particular ornamentation. It gives me an idea. Oh, I want to do that next time.
Absolutely.
It's just
I,
great.
I once watched a speech, a class by Paquito de Rivera, who is like my god of the clarinet and of jazz and of everything. And he's just an amazing, inspirational guy. And,
Pac-Man.
and he was talking about how he learned jazz, and he doesn't really know, I think, how he learned jazz. It was so organic. But he was saying, well, I once heard this solo by, and he named some famous jazz artist, Coltrane or somebody, right? And he say, and it went like this, and then he would play this exact solo that Coltrane had played 30, 40 years ago, whatever, note for note, and he had it all memorized. And so what I got out of that was that great jazz players, yes, they improvise, but improvisation is built on a lot of building blocks that you learn from other places, and then you just learn how to put them together in different ways. And so
Absolutely.
even in my recording, I remember I heard Wenzel Fuchs, our good great colleague from the Berlin Philharmonic. He played a beautiful performance of the Mozart a couple of years ago, and I
Mhm.
loved some ornamentation he did in the third movement. So I said, "Yeah, I like that. I'm gonna
Yep.
use
I want
that."
to do it too.
Yeah.
I love it.
Okay, guys. So I've got a poser for you. The famous passage that everyone plays on the basset clarinet. I haven't got my basset with me, so I can't actually play it. But da da dum. That
Mhm.
Yeah.
passage in the last movement.
Right. Hmm.
Okay, now if you have a look at the score, just going to share screen with you for a second. Uh, uh, where are we? This is, so let's move that across. And here it is. Okay. So we'll see that, generally speaking, this, if you can see online, these
Mhm.
semiquavers, these 16th notes, are all transposed down an octave. And most
Mhm.
basset players, when realizing it on their basset, will think, ah, yes, I can go right down to the low C.
Mhm.
Well, not necessarily, because if you go down to the low C, you're going to be sounding A, and that's actually going to be sounding a third below the cellos. So it depends whether the basses are going to be playing an octave lower than the cellos. And
Mm.
we don't necessarily know whether in Mozart's day the basses always doubled the cello part. Sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. But it's my feeling that Mozart would never have written a 6/3 chord in the orchestra. So that's basically A major with the third at the bottom, and then written the solo line going right down to the tonic. He would never have done that. Mozart didn't make those kinds of mistakes.
Mm.
But
So
I don't.
this for me suggests that possibly the way that basset players over the years, and on my own recording I did this because I loved going right down to the bottom. My feeling is that Mozart would never have written a dominant seventh, then continuing down into a scale in the same direction. If you look in Mozart's music, you never find that figuration anywhere. In violin music, in piano music, you just don't find it. And I think it's much more likely that Mozart would have repeated the dominant seventh figure and probably gone down to an E here. So actually, this for me is I'm a bit skeptical about whether the traditional way of playing this with a scale all the way down to low C is correct or not.
I think that low A is just a very quick passing tone, and yeah, it is below the C sharp. But there's two answers to that. First, if you're playing it on a regular clarinet, what I would do is something like what you just said. I would go like that and go down to the E, right? But on the basset, when you do it, you're just on that note for a brief moment. I mean, because it's so fast. So I don't know that it violates, the classical rule because it's going by so quickly.
I like the fact that it outlines the entire compass.
Right.
Yeah.
It's very.
I get that. I get that. But I have to say, guys, I have looked through most of Mozart's music for piano, all of his violin music, looking for that kind of for figuration that starts with a dominant seventh and then continues in the same direction into a scale. It doesn't exist. It's not stylistically Mozart. So for me, probably, like John mentioned, something like that would probably be more appropriate. But again, you hear that I've had to change the way that the figuration works in order to keep the contour and in order to keep the dominant seventh. Anyway, that's
too bad we don't have this part in Mozart's handwriting. I mean, if we ever discover the manuscript of this piece and the quintet, then
it'll take all the mystery away, won't it?
It would take all the mystery away. I presume that you guys know the novel, historically informed novel called The Mozart Forgeries by Dan Leeson.
Sure. Yeah.
I've heard of
that. That is such an amazing book. Everybody has to read that. It's a page turner because it is so historically informed. It's about these two manuscripts being discovered, or actually being forged, and then the discovery of them being staged on an international level, and then it being auctioned off at Sotheby's, and then the forger and it's a fascinating book. And Dan Leeson, who was an amazing Mozart scholar and, of course, clarinetist and basset horn player, unfortunately no longer with us, but he did so much amazing research into the paper, the actual technique of writing the lines and making the ink and all that this forgery was actually plausible. He covered all the bases. So this is a very, very interesting book, and it's a fantasy for all of us clarinet players to think, gosh, what if the actual manuscripts were discovered, and we could actually look at this one measure and to see, oh, Mozart actually wrote that and not this. So
Dan was a great like you said, a great Mozart scholar. I used to communicate with him all the time on what used to be the clarinet email list, which predated, the web and so forth. And we used to talk all the time. And he was one of the ones who told me for sure when I was working at one point on the Grand Partita, and I wanted to ask him about his opinion about Eingangs, because in the Grand Partita, there are several Eingangs for the first clarinet and it was commissioned basically by the first clarinetist from Mozart. And in those spots, Mozart not only wrote a hold on the dominant seventh, he actually wrote in 4 or 5 notes. So I said to Dan, well, if he wrote the notes in, doesn't that mean that we are supposed to play those notes? He said, absolutely not. He said, no, those were just like an extension of the hold. They're simply placeholder notes, and that according to his research, it's absolutely still an improvised Eingang, and he just put a few notes in there to maybe give you some starter ideas, kind of a thing.
Somebody, I was involved in a a panel discussion similar to this about the Grand Partita. And so there was a performance of the Grand Partita, and Dan was involved with the panel. And somebody asked, is ornamentation allowed in this piece? And he stood up and he said, anybody who doesn't ornament is a communist.
Exactly.
Well, I wouldn't quite go that far. But,
Well,
but
he was
I
very emphatic about it.
think
He was a very funny guy too.
the interesting thing about the sources available, so we've talked a lot about the Winterthur manuscript, and that's only 199 bars,
Right.
but there are other contemporary sources. In particular, there are arrangements. There's an arrangement
Right.
by is it Christian Schwenker, which dates
Right.
from the early 1800s, which is for piano quartet, is it, or piano quintet? Piano
Yeah, it's
quartet, I think.
Quartet, I think.
And
Yeah.
of course, if you think what the poor arranger had to do, any long notes, if you're arranging a clarinet note for a piano, you're probably going to put figuration in place, because the piano is not going to sustain very long. So you're going to have to do something interesting for the piano. So it's not going to be very easy to deduce what might have been in the original if you're just looking at Mr. Schwenker's version. But there's also a version for viola, which was an arrangement of the
Viola.
period, and there's a version for flute, which was an arrangement of the
Right.
period. And these are both available. They're actually, I think, published by Bärenreiter, and they were edited by Christopher Hogwood during his lifetime. And online, you can even hear Paul Silverthorne, the ex-principal viola player of the London Symphony Orchestra, playing this with Hogwood conducting in Taipei. It's not a great orchestra, but it gives you some idea about what might have been in the arranger's mind when he was writing for viola. It's rather an interesting experience, and that's on my list of recordings.
And that Schwenker one, as I recall, when I looked at it, gives you examples of, again, contemporary examples of what the ornamentation might have been like. And as I recall, that one is quite ornate, right?
It is. Oh, yes. The slow
Yeah.
movement is very, very complicated and very
Right.
hard. So if people want that one, that's available, I think, from Universal Edition. It was published during Pamela Weston's lifetime in the 1990s. So, and I think it's, as far as I know, it's still available, isn't it, John?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. I had an experience like John, what you said about Dan Leeson. I was down in Caracas once, 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, and I played a performance of the Mozart Clarinet Quintet with all the same kinds of improvisations, eingangs and stuff that I do in the concerto. And one of the students, actually not one of the students, one of the teachers in Caracas came up to me afterwards, performance, and said, Maestro, great performance, wonderful performance. He said, but why did you play all those notes? And he said, and this, with all seriousness, he said to me, and I won't name who it is, but a very famous teacher of the clarinet had been there recently and said, when you play Mozart, all you should play is what's on the page. And I said, actually, the appropriate question should be asked, why would anybody ever play Mozart without ornamentation? Because if you're not ornamenting, you're not playing Mozart. That was the style. What's on the page in Mozart is very much like jazz. It's an outline of the piece, and you've got to fill in the blanks.
The lead sheet.
Yeah.
So we say that that improvisation is a really important part of it, but maybe a lot of people who are listening to this discussion will be thinking about preparing for auditions and things like that, and they may be wondering, well, how on earth do I play this piece then? If I'm supposed to ornament it, if I'm playing it for an orchestral audition, John, you've been in the Chicago Orchestra for more years than I care to mention, and I was,
Since 1977.
I was in a British
since the
orchestra
year this
for
thing was published.
20-something years, and exactly. So I
43.
mean, and on any orchestral panel, of course, there will be people with different opinions, and there will be people with different acquaintances with the piece, and maybe, they may not necessarily be informed about historically informed performance, and they
Right.
may think, okay, well, Carl Leister is the be all and end all. That's the way to play Mozart. Whereas I think currently people have gone well beyond Carl Leister. The dee da da dee da 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 da, that kind of rather linear, rather Wagnerian performance of Mozart has now disappeared. So could you help us maybe tell those people who've tuned in what would you be listening for these days if someone came along and auditioned for the CSO?
Telling the story, being vocal, being operatic. I mean, after all, this is an operatic piece. It
Yeah,
was presented for the first time in an opera house in Prague.
Right.
And it is steeped in the operatic tradition that Mozart himself was the center of. So you must play this piece using the different characters, using the different scenery, using the different lighting, using the different costumes, if you will, as an operatic performance. And then you can tell a story, and whatever devices you use, whether it be dynamic, coloristic, ornamentational, variety, all go into telling the story. And that's what I want to be, my imagination to be captured by the story that the performer is telling. And it has to do with using all the musical uh, tools available to the performer to be able to tell that story effectively. And of course, it has to be in rhythm and it has to have the right intonation and the right dynamics, and something that's can be sung. If it's not vocal, then it should be reconsidered. I think that's my bottom line. It's
yeah,
got to
yeah,
be, it's got to sound as vocal as possible, and that goes to the shaping and the envelope of every individual note or every individual phrase or every individual cell. It's got to be vocal. And if you
Totally.
hear it vocally, it is not a foregone conclusion that you can produce it that way on our instrument. Our instrument is notoriously anti-musical, anti-vocal. You have to have mind over matter to make it sound vocal,
Right.
because the natural tendency is for things to start from nothing and to go, like that. And if you let that happen, it's going to sound the opposite of vocal.
Right.
So the importance is to ingrain a sense, a very, very strong picture of how a piece, any piece, but we're talking about this concerto, how it would sound vocally. So you'd have to sing it. I would say, I tell people, in the privacy of your own practice room, how would you sing this piece?
hmm
Tum, ti, dum, ti, da, da, dum, ti, dum, ti, dum, ti, dum. And then use the different visual aspects. I often think about bowings. Jonathan is very, very into that. You've got to really get all of different tools to your to be able to express this in a vocal on a vocal level. But the main thing is the plan has to be there very, very strongly in your mind's imagination before you can begin to impart that. You have to
Right.
have a very, very, very strong
If you don't know
plan.
what you want to say, it comes out sounding like you don't know what you want to say. Exactly.
Right.
But
Hmm.
the interesting thing about that question that I always find from Nick is, and what I say, and it's obviously an exaggeration, but I like to make exaggerations to make things clear. I always say orchestra auditions and music have nothing to do with each other. And now, obviously, that's an exaggeration. Some people will take offense at that, but that's okay. It gets their
No,
attention.
it's
So, what I
right.
mean by that is when you do an orchestra audition, or any audition, but especially orchestra auditions, you are playing for a committee of people that you want to get passed by. The most important people on that committee, even if they have 10 people, if you're doing a clarinet audition, there's going to be two clarinets on that jury, right? Maybe four, who knows, right? And whoever's on that jury, they're going to mostly defer to the clarinetists if it's a clarinet audition. So you have to know who those people are and what they like. So if you're playing for John Bruce Yeh, yes, go in there, be vocal, be musical, shape the phrase this way, do all that stuff, improvise, do some tasteful, not too much, but tasteful improvisation, and John will love you. Not all clarinetists are like that, however.
Right.
So when you're doing an audition, it's not about what I call music is being truthful to the composer and the original intent. Okay. And many orchestras play beautifully and are fabulous players, but they play everything wrong. Most orchestras play Beethoven 9 totally incorrectly. They play Beethoven 5 totally incorrectly. They play Beethoven 6 totally incorrectly. And if you go in there and play it correctly, they're going to say, wow, we don't do it like that. We don't like that. He's not in our style, right? So you need to know first who you're playing for, and then never do anything. I tell my students, it has to be perfect, in rhythm, nice sound, in tune, all that stuff. It has to be musical, but not too musical. If you're too extreme, someone's not going to like you. And when I judge competitions, I see this all the time. You'll have a bunch of finalists, all of whom are great players, right? Because they made the finals. They're all great, and we shouldn't be. Competitions are a bad thing, but we have to have them, right? So they're all great players. One of them does something that I say, "Wow, that was amazing," because he did something very emphatic and very, And then another famous guy on the jury with me, who's also a great player, hates it. I mark the kid first. The other guy marks him last. And who ends up winning? The guy who got marked second by everybody, because he was great and he never did anything too extreme. So there's that game you have to play of balance and knowing who your audience is. When you're performing, just playing music in front of an audience, it's all about you and the audience, and there's nobody judging. They're just having a good time, and you play it however you want. You could be as extreme as you want. They're going to love you if you do a great job. With a jury, that's not always the case, right?
Unfortunately, I mean the downfall of our committee type of auditions that we have today. It has to be you have to be kind of middle of the road to not offend anybody.
Right.
And so, but that maybe works in the preliminary in getting past to the finals. But in the finals, you have to spark everybody's imagination in a very deep musical way. And that's, I think, oftentimes the music director is presiding over a final audition, and that's when you really have to capture the imagination of the people that you're playing for.
Right. Do you guys also do? I think you also do trials with the orchestra, right?
Yes,
Right.
absolutely.
So you got to actually be able to play well in context.
Show where you can be together as a team player.
Right.
And I hate to interrupt. We have some questions that I would like to ask everyone. This is such a great discussion. Let's see. First of all, could you talk about the tempo on the first movement of this concerto?
Well, yeah. I mean, historically, if you listen to, say, for instance, Jack Brymer's recording from the early 60s, he plays it very, very slowly, and I don't think these days we would probably want to hear it like that. Then if you listen to someone like Wolfgang Mayer, for instance, with Harnoncourt, I think those are very good speeds that he chooses, and even on the period instrument, it's very good. So I would kind of tend to the to a kind of moderate allegro. I think not a fast allegro for the first movement, certainly. That's my opinion anyway.
I think if it sounds good.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I think if it sounds good in that particular venue, then I think it's a good tempo. Basically you have to kind of try it out, and also the context of the eighth note, underpinning in the orchestra, I think will sort of dictate how is it comfortable for a bunch of cellos to be chun 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 like that.
Exactly.
I think in a general statement, and one of the things I did in my edition is I put in metronome marks everywhere. Obviously, the metronome didn't exist in Mozart's time, so those are my opinions, but they're based on research that I did. one thing that we sort of generally know is that Mozart, like kind of like Mendelssohn and others, liked fast, quote unquote, tempos in a general sense. Okay, but the speed that something sounds at depends a lot on how it's played. So, in other words, I could play something at a certain speed. If I played, which is quite fast, but it doesn't really sound fast because I did it in a way that sounded very easy and flowing. I started a little bit slower and I gradually got a little bit faster and then I inflected a little bit. But if I played it metronomically evenly and went, it sounds a lot faster all of a sudden, even though it's essentially the same speed. So how, for example, the marking that I chose for this movement was about 128, and I probably do it between 128 and 132 when I perform it. Some people might think that's very fast, but if you're playing along or you do, it's not too fast because it sounds nice. But if it sounds like you're stretched and at the limit of what you can do and things are getting uneven or iffy and they don't sound mellifluous and easy, then that tempo is, then people will say to you, that's too fast. I'll say to a student, if it doesn't sound easy, it's too fast, right? So, it's a lot about perception too, right?
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Another question, is it rare to see crossouts in Mozart manuscripts just because everyone knows how spontaneously he was known to write?
It's rare, but not unheard of, because that one spot that Nick pointed out where he crossed that spot out and wrote bis, I mean, it's just part, you can see his, the cogs turning in his mind's wheel. Basically, everything was already composed when he wrote it out. And you can see that on all his full manuscripts. The Gran Partita manuscript is a perfect example. And there are very, very few places where any corrections were made.
Right. Yeah, he was known as being he was more like Shostakovich uh, than Beethoven. Beethoven was known
Oh.
for making sketches, rewriting, crossing out, changing detail. Mozart, yeah, sure, he crossed things out and added little things, but the large part, like John was saying, it's amazing how clean his scores are. Amazing. I couldn't imagine doing that. I mean, all with the hand, no computers, no Sibelius.
And another question, why do you think so many of the details you were discussing earlier changed by the time the first edition came out?
That's an interesting story. We know why that is. In 1801 or 2, I forget the date, it's in my article that's at the front of my score, a guy who published what was called the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, the music newspaper of the musical times of Germany,
Mm-hmm.
he wrote an article and he was reviewing the score of the Mozart concerto, and he actually had the score in front of him. One of the great mysteries is whatever happened to this score, but we know that in 1802 he had it in front of him because he cites some examples from it, and he talks about the low C's and all the low notes, and he actually writes out musical examples in this review that's published, and anybody can go on the web and see. But I cite it in my article, and he said, but it's unfortunate, at that same time, between 1801 and 1802, 4 different publishers published the concerto. It seems that one of, probably Breitkopf was first, and Breitkopf had already completely modified the clarinet part. And he had already changed all those octaves, all the stuff that's in all the modern editions. They had already destroyed it. And I said, I'll read you just some my own translations of what he wrote. He said, finally, the reviewer must note that Mozart wrote this concerto for a clarinet that goes down to low C. So, for example, the following passages in the solo part are all written in the lower octave. And then he gave written out examples. Now, he then went on to point out that and he said it in diplomatic terms, but he's basically saying that it's unfortunate he destroyed the part. He says, noting, however, that currently such clarinets which go down to low C are still rather uncommon instruments, one owes to the editors for these transpositions and changes for the ordinary clarinet, even though the concerto did not gain from that. Translated, he screwed up the part. He's saying it didn't help it, meaning it destroyed it. Maybe it would have been just as good. In other words, maybe it would have been better, the diplomatic way of saying better. Maybe it would have been just as good to publish it as in the original score and note the transpositions and changes as needed with smaller notes. But unfortunately, Breitkopf didn't do that. And I believe all the other publishers had just copied that one. So they destroyed the part in 1801. It was
Right.
destroyed ever since then until the
Corrupted, and
research,
then
you know.
and then research had to be done in the late 20th century or mid 20th century to correct that.
Right.
But yeah, I think a lot of those octave transpositions are just arbitrary and
Totally. Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the discovery that it might not have been for an actual clarinet was effectively in the 1940s. It was a chap called George Daisley. And I think in one of the resources that has been shared with you in the file I've shared in the chat, you'll find a reference to George Daisley's article. It was more or less contemporaneous with a chap in the Czech Republic called Jiří Kratochvil and
Right.
Milan Kosteric, who also came up with more or less the same idea at the
Right.
same time. But I think it was George Daisley who published it in the Musical Times, and basically he was going on instinct and saying, you know, the contours of these parts in the Mozart look as if they've been tampered with. They look as if they're not what Mozart might have written, because, you know, probably for the same reasons that I've given about that little passage in the third movement not probably being what Mozart wrote.
Well, you know, that passage you
So-
mentioned, that one, the problem with going back up to the B is that Mozart would never have written that skip up of a sixth, because that's also a violation. So we know it can't be that. So that, but maybe it's something else. Who knows? I mean, there's so many problems, you know.
The final question, and I know you've talked about this a little bit, but if there's anything else that you'd like to add. So should we play this concerto in a slow tempo, like in the 18th century, or could we play it a little bit faster because we're in the 21st century? Could we add the phrases, classical, modern? How do we play the Mozart concerto?
Well, yeah, I think you have to make it yours, and you have to make it convincing, and you have to take a point of view.
Yeah.
Sing it, make it sound good,
Exactly.
make it sound attractive, make your listener want to hear it all the way through. You be your own critic and decide, well, is this tempo faster than I can play it and make all the communications that I want to do? Then try a slower tempo. Is this tempo so slow that I have to like be much more colorful? Then take a faster tempo. You have, it's all about the exploration and the adventure that you go through in order to get to the communication with your audience. I think it's a matter of experimentation. Take into account, you have to be informed by the context. Know who's playing in the orchestra at all times. Know who's not playing. Know when they stop the motor, like, that's when the motor stops, and then and then the motor starts again. So you have to know when those things happen in the context, and then shape your own part, the performance of your own part to match. The context really rules everything. That's the thing. You have to be familiar with that, with the orchestral context. And like I mentioned, if you're performing it in a venue that's very dry, you might want to take a faster tempo. And conversely, in a venue that's very, very echoey, you may need to take a slower tempo to be able to let all the inflections be understood by the listener. I think it's a process that you have to arrive at your own tempo, how it sounds good.
John's mentioned the eighth notes and how they come across, and that they kind of drive everything along. And I think that goes to the heart of the classical style. And for me, I would always say, the speeds that you choose have to really reflect your understanding of classical style. And for me, I've spent a lot of the years of my life editing French classical music, actually. So I kind of know quite a lot about the articulation forms and the articulation style of French classical music. And then when you come to Mozart, you immediately see similarities. You immediately see, for instance, that 4/4 is never really a four quarter notes in a bar. It's actually 2 minims in a bar, 2 half notes in a bar. So you need to feel it as I mentioned to John, C stroke, so C with a line through it, as opposed to C. So we need to hear beats 1 and 3 all the time, and we need to really respect those with the articulation. And if the tempo is too slow and it starts to feel in 4, then it's not classical anymore. Similarly, if you're playing the last movement and you balk at the speed of the semiquavers, the 16th notes, repeating them and articulating them, and it starts to feel a little bit slow in 2, then we're not going to get the interest of the 8th notes coming through. And the 8th notes repeat all the way in Mozart. So we can't really play the 8th notes the same all the time. If you play the 8th notes the same, then the music stops for the listener. So there has to be some progression all the way through these 8th notes. And then if you get that, we get this feeling of moving through the bar, and then the bar, the music, the rondo becomes exciting. And a really good performance of that will achieve this. It doesn't really matter what speed it's in, but a good performance of it will achieve that.
One of the interesting things about the classical period is the tradition then was to not put too many markings in the music. If you go back to Bach, it's even fewer markings. But that wasn't because they didn't want shaping and direction. It was because it was assumed the musician was an educated person who did all the structural and harmonic analysis and directional analysis and knew how to then shape that. Because music, like John has said and Nick has said, is all about shape and direction. And so the speed, it is not, you need to find the speed from how you're shaping the thing and then how it naturally flows, and then tie it back to what he said. If he said allegro, that's got to be a really fairly flowing tempo. But like the way John sang the opening phrase, he sang, right? He didn't sing, right, which is the way you hear most people play it. You had shape immediately from the first note. Already the first note had shape. That was an epiphany that I had when I was about 15 or 16 years old, and I was listening to one of our former teachers, John, Harold Wright. Mm-hmm. I was listening to a recording of his, I forget which one, of Weber or something. Mm-hmm. And he played one note. I think it was a D on the 4th line. He played one note, and I said, wow, that note sounded really cool and expressive. How do you make expression on one note? Mm-hmm. And it was all about how he shaped it, how he attacked it, what he did in the middle of the note, how he vibrated it, all those things.
The coloristic variety.
Yeah.
Turning the kaleidoscope.
Exactly.
Yeah. And of course, over our lifetime, how you play that opening phrase has changed entirely, isn't it? I mean, you might have heard it, for instance, years ago, played in a kind of Leicester kind of way. Mm-hmm. And these days, you're much more likely to hear something akin to this. So there'll be a little bit of a release on the first note, and you'll hear the middle of the bar. Possibly a little bit more, because if you were a player of a period instrument, you wouldn't dream of playing a straight note. Most notes in classical music would have a natural decay on them, and these days, that's why it's so difficult to play it for an orchestra, because not all orchestral players are used to historical performance. They won't actually have that in their heads.
I've sat next to Carl on some juries, and I've had long discussions with him, and Carl is a absolute avid fan and extremely knowledgeable about opera. He knows a million times more than I know about opera. He's always talking about opera singers and things like that. And he loves operatic playing. So sometimes people have an idea in their head, and maybe it comes out more or less in how they play. And maybe he's actually thinking and doing that, but it doesn't come out quite as much because of you know, the surrounding of his orchestra and what he had to do to blend with the orchestra. Who knows? You know, there's many things. But I remember him always talking about operatic phrasing.
Mhm.
And he tended to like, when we were judging on juries together, he liked the wilder players more than the sedate players.
And John made that point about, discovering the operatic in Mozart, and there are, because this is a mature piece of Mozart, it's one of his last pieces.
Right.
There are places in the concerto where you can spot exactly how it's operatic. In fact, in that first movement, the mere fact that we have such a huge range and Mozart is exploiting the bass notes or the basset notes of the instrument and then the soprano notes of the instrument, you see this happening the whole time between the clarinet and the orchestra. The clarinet becomes the bass, he goes down and joins the cello section, and the cello section then picks it up. There's a wonderful passage. I'll just share screen. I've got this, I hope, on screen. Now let's have a quick look. Here it is, yes. This passage that we referred to earlier. You'll notice when we get to this passage here, all of a sudden the basset clarinet leaps down. Here it's written up an octave, but it actually leaps down another octave and goes down and joins the cello section here. And then it's taken over by the cello section. And then he leaps up 2 octaves and becomes the dominant force here. Now this rhythm here is operatic. We haven't seen that before. And what follows is operatic as well, because the 2 violin parts go up into their upper register and they're vying for the control of this upper register. And then the clarinet, he plunges down to the depths and he becomes the accompaniment there. What's he accompanying? Well, he's actually using the same material that is then used by the tutti. And so Mozart he's eroding the strict delineation between solo and tutti here. He's actually being very challenging to us in formal terms of what is happening in the concerto itself. And along John's lines, he's being terribly operatic. Find the operatic in Mozart.
He's also showing one of the unique capabilities of the clarinet is the only instrument that can do with no break, which is why when most people play this and they go, but that's wrong. First of all, that's an eighth note, not a quarter note. Mozart knew the difference between eighths and quarters. And if you look at his scores, he very, very carefully marks eighth notes where he wants them. He didn't want an eighth note there. He didn't want a space. He does mark an articulation because of the big skip, but no space. And so and he's highlighting the fact, look at what this clarinet can do. You can't do that on a violin. Violin, if you go from G string to an E string, there has to be a space, right? Okay, but the clarinet can go, and that triplet is a very important thing. You mentioned it because it's the first 16th note triplet that appears in the piece, and everyone plays this as though it's regular 16th notes. They go, those are 6, but that's not nearly as brilliant. If I go, they're too slow. Mozart wrote it as a triplet because it's very exciting all of a sudden. And he's doing it after this massive operatic leap. The opera singer, of course, doing a big leap would also throw in would put a portato in there. Now, we can't do that because that would sound like jazz or klezmer, but we can connect the notes even without that, right?
Love it.
Well, I hate to be the person that stops this incredible conversation, but we have to prepare for our next session, which means I have to render this video and get it up on YouTube for people who weren't able to join us early. But I am incredibly grateful to you 3 for being here and for everybody that's participated in the comments and chatting. This has been such an incredible session, and there's a lot to chew on regarding this piece, and I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. I've been sitting here just thinking about, and any time you hear a session like this, you think, man, I really need to go back and visit that, because it's just a piece that's always with you. And when you do go back and visit it, you love it even more, right? It's always that way for me. So thank you again. Please go look up the recordings. Please check out Jonathan's new edition of this piece. Please check out the December issue of the Clarinet, in which we have a wonderful interview with Bruce Yeh, and he's on the cover looking very, very cool. And
My
please,
favorite baseball player.
That's right.
Oh, yes.
I got my extra long bat today. See?
Oh, yes.
And Nicholas has been so great in sharing a resource list as well as the thesis that was shared in the chat. And those resources will all be available on the ICA website. So if you missed the session, be sure to check those out to get more information that was shared here. But thank you again. And we will see you at 2 o'clock for our next session.
Great.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Jessica.
everybody.
Jenny.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
you
Great to
guys.
see you guys.
everybody.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Jess. Thank you, Jenny.